Welcome to Ladies Talking Love, episode 19, Debunking Male Sexuality Myths. It's Ladies Talking Love, a community of women uncovering more joy and fulfillment in sex as we learn from experts and amazing women like you. Together, let's create a world where women's sexuality is celebrated and understood, beginning with our own. I'm your host, Ariel Finlinson. Let's talk love. I have been so excited to get this episode out ever since I saw the book, Not Always in the Mood, by Dr. Sarah Hunter Murray. She debunks so many myths that I commonly believed growing up and are portrayed everywhere, from the media to conversations with our friends and families, and they're myths, and you have to check what your spouse or partner actually feels. So I'm so grateful to have her on today. Dr. Sarah Hunter Murray is a registered marriage and family therapist who holds a PhD in human sexuality from the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada. She is a regularly sought after sex and relationship expert who has been featured in the Huffington Post, Today's Parent, Men's Health, and the Globe and Mail. Sarah authors the popular Psychology Today blog, Myths of Desire, and is the author of the book, Not Always in the Mood, The New Science of Men, Sex, and Relationships. Before we jump in, I just wanted to let you know that I'm planning to split this podcast into seasons, and this is the second to last episode of season 1. So there will be a great finale episode next week, a roundtable episode that I'm really excited about. But I just wanted to give you a heads up. I'd been going back and forth trying to decide if I should do seasons or not, but I think at this point in my life, it will work best to kind of split it up and prep for the next season so that I can keep the goodness coming. But this doesn't mean I'm going anywhere. I will still be around on Instagram and prepping for season 2. There's not going to be a huge break, like a couple weeks. I'll keep you guys posted, maybe several weeks. I'll let you know on Instagram, but I'm still going to be recording and looking for topic ideas and guests to reach out to, and of course, roundtables. So please reach out to me with any of your thoughts and ideas. I would appreciate all of it. Anyway, I just wanted to give you a heads up. Thanks so much for being here on this journey with me and learning together. It means so much. I've been so excited to have Dr. Sarah Hunter Murray join me on Ladies Talking Love to talk about her book and her research. This is such a treat. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
So before we kind of jump into some of the questions and some of the things about your book and research, I would just love to know how you first started getting interested in studying about desire and the impact of our social norms on our views of sexuality and how it affects men and women's views of sexuality, all the things. I just love to hear how you kind of started your journey.
I guess it all started in undergrad. I was doing psychology courses and I stumbled upon a human sexuality class and my eyes just opened. I was like, this is so important. And I just was so curious. And the first research job that I got was in a hospital where there was doctors prescribing at the time, like this topical testosterone treatment for women who had low desire to see if it would up their sexual desire. And the thing that just stood out to me is that while the doctors were talking about this kind of medical piece, the nurses that I was working with, who actually were like spending more time with the clients and the women at that time, were saying, you know what, this treatment isn't going to work because they actually have told me they're in a really unhappy relationship. And it just kind of started to be like, oh, like sexual desire and this want to have sex is just so complex and so nuanced. And as a woman, a cisgender woman, I started studying women's desire. I was like, we are so complex and there's so much that impacts our desire, from our relationships to social messages to just how we were raised, images that we see in media. And so I just dug right in. And so for my master's degree, I spent my time researching women's sexual desire. And I love qualitative research. So I love interviewing women, kind of getting into the nitty gritty of their experience and figuring out like what helps them feel more desire, what decreases their desire, and kind of all within the context of these relationships. And it wasn't until starting my PhD where I started to kind of question how much focus was on women's sexual desire. And it's such an important topic. I love all the research that's being done out there. It's important. There's still more to learn. But I started kind of questioning, like, all the research seems to be on women's sexual desire. And we tend to kind of talk about men versus women.
Mm-hmm.
Women's sexual desire is complex. Women are the ones who have lower desire. And men, in contrast, we were just making all these assumptions. It's high, constant, unwavering, simple. And there are stereotypes that we see all across society, which just reinforce this idea. Men are only out for one thing. They're always down to have sex. They want multiple sexual partners. Like, they are just horny, sex crazed, like beings. And I just started to question, like, is that really true? Like, does that really resonate for men? Because that feels like kind of an unfair assumption, if not. So I started digging in and did the same thing, researched by interviewing men, kind of asking them, like men in longer term relationships, like, is this true? Like, does this accurately reflect your experiences? Where, when, and where does it maybe kind of differ? So hence where I'm at today, and having written this book and kind of continuing to talk and promote this new discourse on men's sexual desire.
And I love that so much, because that's how I kind of started my journey too. I dug in reading books that had been done about women's desire and women's sexuality, and it was all really important. But then when I saw your book, it's called Not Always in the Mood, just the title, I was like, yes, I want to read this book, because there are so many myths that we see perpetuated in our conversations, in our views, in the media, just all these things. And I love how you talk about that in your book, like some of your favorite TV shows, even you're like, oh, I think you mentioned This Is Us. You're like, yeah. I love the TV show, but we're perpetuating these stereotypes. And I realized on my own journey that these stereotypes had really harmed my relationship with my spouse, because I viewed him in a way that wasn't necessarily accurate. And I needed to see where he was coming from instead of just taking it at face value, what we'd been told.
So important. And I mean, I'm sure we'll talk about it as we go today, but there are lots of harmful myths that impact men negatively. And my research mostly focuses on heterosexual couples, or at least partners there's a man and a woman in a relationship. And the beliefs that women are raised to, like, we all exist in society. And so men are being fed these messages, women are being fed these messages, and it certainly has a negative impact on a number of couples.
I love that it has a negative impact on both of us, because I think sometimes we miss that these myths about men actually are affecting men negatively and women, and our ability to create good, long-term, healthy relationships. And we are talking more about heterosexual couples today.
Yeah.
But let's go ahead and jump in a little bit. We don't have time to cover all the myths in the book, but they tie together, and we'll see what we get to. As you did your research, as you kind of started studying this, where did these myths about men's sexuality originate?
Yeah, so I mean, there's some really good reasons that we do tend to think of men's sexual desire as being high, constant, simple. One of the places is kind of from evolutionary theory. And every time I talk about this, I like to just reiterate, there's not enough time to give due diligence to the complexities of evolutionary theory. But in a nutshell, there is this idea that men have historically benefited from spreading their seed, like being wired to spread their seed. Going back decades ago, centuries ago, like, the more that men had a high sex drive, if there was a possibility of procreating, they were ready for it. And so the most virile men, had most sexual partners, passed on their genes, and that was rewarded over time. So from an evolutionary standpoint, it's thought that men actually just have this higher biological urge to have sex in order to procreate. But what I'm more interested in is the social norms. In our society, men are typically rewarded for being more open with their sexuality. I think a lot of us, if we think back to our teenage years, consider the differences. Women most often are taught to kind of repress their sexuality. They're chastised. They're, given even negative names like slut or, things like that, if they have sexual partners or they're sexually active earlier on. Men, on the other hand, tend to still be rewarded for that. Way to go. You got laid. You had sex with, all of these people. Like, there's still a social reward system that gives men more space to explore their sexuality, and if they're reinforced that way. So there becomes this standard of men's desire is high, according to evolutionary theory. But from a social standpoint, it's like men's sexual desire should be high. Taking it even a step further, this idea of masculinity theory, what the most masculine of all men looks like, is the most sexually driven never would say no. Like men have this high sex drive and there's this standard that has to be met that a lot of men are kind of chasing. Mm-hmm. And as we'll talk about, there's some difficulties that happen when men naturally don't meet those really unrealistic norms.
And I think that it's so interesting to think that when we perpetuate those ideas, then our men feel broken or they feel pushed to maybe over-sexualize themselves because what we have been portraying as is normal for them. And so I love that we're talking about this. You talked about in your book that there's one overarching myth that ties all the myths together. Can you cover that briefly for us?
I guess just kind of dovetailing off what we were just saying is this masculinity myth. So there is this notion that in order to be a man, a real man, the manliest of all men, it's this over the top stereotype that I am always down to have sex. Like anytime my partner wants it, I'm there. And the expectation is that men are comfortable playing by these rules. What was interesting for me is through my interviews is men were very aware that the stereotype existed. Some felt it was out there and didn't impact them. But as we talked through our interviews, they noted like, actually, yeah, I do feel pressure sometimes. I feel bad when I say no. Like there was this time where I wasn't in the mood where my, wife or girlfriend initiated, and I felt so bad about myself. I didn't meet that norm. I didn't meet that expectation. And so there's this internalization of what is expected versus what is authentically felt. And in that discrepancy, some of the men I spoke to would say that sometimes they would feign sexual interest because that was what they were supposed to do, quote unquote, right? They didn't want to let themselves down. They kind of considered like, what would, one of the dudes say if they found out or if I were to talk about that? And again, like we were talking about how men and women are both raised in the society with these norms. There was a lot of men who talked about like, what would my wife or girlfriend or partner, think if I said no to sex? Would they judge me as being less than manly? Would they take that as a hit on my manliness? So there was a lot of poking holes in this, recognizing that it's out there, recognizing that it impacts us, but also kind of saying, man, is it hard sometimes to try to play by those rules?
And I know for me in my own relationship, if my spouse were to say no, sometimes it's like, oh, am I not desirable anymore? Instead of just taking it at face value, like I would hope he would for me, like, oh, maybe we're a little stressed. Maybe she just needs a hug for a minute, but instead it's suddenly like, oh, he doesn't want me anymore. And I think it exacerbates problems in our relationship too. And we have those views about each other. You've touched on this maybe a little bit, but what were some of the most surprising discoveries for you as you started to compile research and write the book?
Just generally speaking, I really didn't go into my research with really too much of an idea of what I was going to find. Like I really did go into this kind of open, like, is it going to reinforce these stereotypes? Is it not? So looking back, I mean, the thing that I was really struck by is, wow, like men's sexual desire is more complex than I thought too. Like, it's not like I went into this expecting that it was going to be really, really complicated. I was really uncertain about that. And so it was just so interesting as the interviews started happening to think, wow, like, not only are there times that men aren't in the mood, but they're talking about their sexual desire being a lot more emotional. They are talking about wanting to feel wanted, wanting to feel desired, feeling a lot of pressure to be the one who is the initiator or the one that makes their female partner feel desired all the time, that their looks and appearance don't matter at all. That there was like all these times that they'd say, you know what, there are things more important than sex. Like sometimes I just want a good sleep. Sometimes I'm tired. Sometimes there's a game on and I'm just not thinking about sex because I'm a human being and not a robot and not ready to go right now. So generally speaking, I mean, the first thing that stood out to me is, okay, like there's a lot more going on here. And do I, as a woman who was raised in the society, do I ever have a lot to unlearn about men's sexual desire too? The thing that I found probably the most surprising out of all of them, though, was this idea of desirability. And so what we know about women's sexual desire is that we love feeling wanted. Like we're used to, and we're trained to, for better or for worse, to be chased. Again, this goes back to our early teenage, early adult years. We're told that we look pretty. There's this social expectation that we like take care of ourselves and prim and primp. And men, again, in this kind of heterosexual context, are the ones that approach us, that tell us that we look good. They invite us out for a date. They bring flowers. They propose. Like that is the kind of stereotype. When it comes to sex, it was also the same thing. Men are the ones who initiate sex. They're the ones who kind of, women wear lingerie and men are the ones who kind of put on the moves. And what we know from the research is women, when they feel desire, that's a big spike for their sexual desire, right? If they feel like I'm wanted and he finds me sexy, that's a boost. If women feel that their partner isn't giving them that kind of attention and they don't feel that they perceive them as sexy or desirable, their sexual desire goes down. What was fascinating to me is men recognized that in their relationships, this was the common dynamic, but they really said that it was actually important to them that they feel desire too. They didn't like this sexual script. They didn't like this kind of one-way dynamic. They really wanted to have their female partner initiate sex with them, to make them feel desired and wanted. And it didn't always have to be sexual. Sometimes it was just romantic. For her to be the one to come over and give me a rub on my shoulders, for her to come and give me a kiss or a hug, for her to tell me that I look really handsome or that she likes the color of that shirt on me. And what was interesting is not just that men kind of were breaking from this traditional script and saying how important it was. They also said that this script is so dominant that they felt that most of their partners weren't aware of how important it was to them. And it was kind of hard to even figure out how to name it because, again, would I be manly if I said, I want you to tell me that I look good?
Yes. And I think it's so fascinating that the stereotypes about some of women's sexuality stereotypes and men's, like, they work against each other, that we shouldn't initiate, that we should be the ones who are more passive, but like they're working against each other. And we need to kind of shift both of those. I think that's so fascinating to hear that. And I know that was one for me too. I didn't recognize that my partner probably wanted to be desired as well. And of course, I need to talk to him about that to know what he really thinks. But it is important. And he has talked about that it feels good for me to show I want him just like he wants to be with me. So I think that's a really fascinating discovery. And I'm so glad you did the research.
Well, and what you're saying too, I mean, about this, how we can work together, in this context is so critical, right? I love working with men and women who are in relationships with each other to help women also consider, are there ways that I've kind of dampened my sexuality because I've been trained to be the gatekeeper, to be receptive or responsive, instead of considering, hey, what if I think about, I'm in the mood for sex, like, am I initiating or am I kind of playing into that stereotype of waiting to see if he's ready? What would it be like for me to kind of put something out there or start something? Can I deal with the rejection if he says no?
Yeah.
But I think it's actually really empowering. And I love watching that dynamic shift, especially when in clinical setting, when I get to work with couples, kind of challenging that dynamic.
And to have the courage to say it too, because I think sometimes as women, we might give more subtle cues that our partner's like, I didn't even know. You got to say it. And it's empowering and scary, but I think it's good for both of us in the relationship.
Yeah.
So I know for the sake of time, we won't be able to cover all of them, but I'd love if we can maybe cover a little bit about the physical appearance myth. Can you tell us what that myth is and what you learned about it?
Sure, of course. So the physical appearance myth, I mean, this myth is the idea that for men, physical appearance is the ultimate or maybe the most important factor that is going to get them to feel sexual desire. So again, within this context of heterosexual relationships, it would be being attracted to a partner or woman who's wearing like a low-cut blouse, short skirt. It's all about breasts, legs, someone who's sexy wearing lingerie, that is kind of like what does it, that men are like just visual creatures and that is enough to get them turned on. What I like to say about this myth is not that those things aren't true or that they're not true in some cases. I mean, it's awesome if we're putting on lingerie and our partner might like it. I mean, wonderful, celebrate that, that's fun. What I thought was really interesting though, is that while men that I talked to recognize that physical appearance mattered, right? They felt attracted to their partner, whatever they looked like. It doesn't have to be that stereotypical hourly figure and all of that, but they still said they would be attracted to their female partner. But what mattered more than anything was that emotional connection. So some men would talk about how, their female partner might be kind of doing maybe what you're talking about, maybe those more subtle cues where it's like, maybe I'll wear something a little suggestive. But men would say, you know what, if we've been off, if we haven't been connected, if we haven't been talking, if we're still kind of in the middle of a fight that hasn't been resolved, it's just not enough to get me there. And I thought that was what was so interesting, especially for those of us in longer term relationships, to recognize that, when men want sex, it's not just about that physical release. It's not just being targeted by physical level characteristics. There's so much more emotions, I think, that are getting ignored. So to kind of consider, like, are we getting along? Are we feeling connected? Have we spent quality time together recently? Are we feeling kind of lovey-dovey and romantic? And if those pieces aren't there, then the physical stuff doesn't matter all that much.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I really like about this myth is, again, just kind of dipping down a little bit more. I mean, again, from the eyes, maybe more into the heart and soul of men, and to say, what else is really getting me going here? What turns me on? And also, what are the things that turn me off? And it's maybe a lot to expect, me to be jumping at the chance to have sex, having an erection, feeling turned on, if my heart's not in the right place.
Mm-hmm.
And that is such a reasonable, understandable, perfectly valid reason to not have a high sex drive or not feel like having sex in that moment. And I think one that gets ignored far too often.
I loved learning about that myth because I think it was just so helpful for me to recognize even more. I had inklings. I was like, I think it's more of an emotional connection for men too, but we aren't taught that. We aren't shown that. And just how not having that basis of an emotional connection, I think it cheapens the intimacy of the experience for both of us, especially like you were saying, in relationships, we are long-term committed. We're working on this together. I think it really cheapens it to not have that basis, because that's what creates a beautiful, intimate experience for me, is the basis and then adding on to it with our intimate life, instead of just it's all about appearance and just getting busy. And I loved that idea, because I think we do downplay a lot more than is necessary how important emotional connection is for men as well.
And the thing that I like to say about this, it's not necessarily turning sex into something that has to be mushy, lovey-dovey all the time.
Yes.
But you can have a nice romantic connection, feel like you're on the same page, and then have kinky, fun sex.
Totally,
right?
totally.
It's not limiting the type of sex that's being
Yes.
had. It's just saying, are we a team here? Like,
Yeah.
are we feeling like we're on the same page? And then we can play and have fun and like experiment and do all these other things.
Yes.
But if that connection isn't there, it's a lot to expect of ourselves, I think, as women. Like, we would say, wait, why would you even initiate right now? We're not even getting along.
Yeah.
But the expectation is that if it's reversed, it's like, well, what's wrong with you? Why don't you want to have sex right now? And it's like,
Totally.
No, for men, it's okay to say, no, we feel like things are a little off right now. I'm just not there today.
Let's connect. And then I think it leaves room for more fun, exploratory sex, because at least from my side, like, I feel safer to explore those things when I have a good emotional and safe connection. Can you tell us a little more about the initiation and desirability myth?
The idea is that men are the ones to initiate sexual activity. The expectation, the scripts are that they're the ones who push the next level. They're the ones that woo. It's all on their shoulders. The thing that I thought was interesting within this, especially during my interview stage of research, was that men talked about how not only was the expectation there that they initiate, it was like, even if they got the sense that their female partner was maybe interested, maybe in those subtle ways again that you were kind of mentioning earlier, they still felt like the onus was on them to initiate. And so sometimes they would initiate even if they weren't necessarily feeling it, because the expectation was, I have to. It shows that I'm interested in her. That's important. And so it was another example of how men were sometimes feigning a sexual interest. Not like sex is bad and this is the worst thing, but just coming at it from more of a neutral place and feeling like, why is the onus on me to make sex happen in our relationship? And why isn't it coming back from her end more often? So again, just this importance of being seen, feeling desired, feeling wanted, getting a chance to respond to sexual stimuli versus always being the one to kind of put it out there. So this idea of like men just wanting to feel wanted, wanting to feel desired through sexual initiation, from their female partner, to not always have to be the one to do it. Again, just kind of creating these more balanced relationships where there's give and take, and men really challenging this idea of always being in the power position, the control position, right? Like always being the ones to call the shots. There was a lot of talk about wanting to be more of a passive partner sometimes, right? To be the recipient, to get to choose. Do I feel like having sex with you? You were starting something with me. I get to feel wanted. I get to feel chased. I get to feel wooed. And just how important that was, and how often it's being overlooked. from the men I've talked to, they're feeling it's being very much overlooked in their relationships.
What would you give as some tips to the women in the relationships? Because this can be new for a lot of us and scary, like we talked about earlier, that as a woman, having your man say no because of the way we were raised can bring up a lot of really, really difficult feelings and fear. What are some tips you would give us as we maybe start to move toward recognizing I want my spouse or partner to feel desired? How can I start doing this in a safe place, even if they say no?
So the desirability, I mean, men talked about it could be initiating sex, but it could also be romantic touch. It could be flirtation. It could be a compliment. And so what I would say is, depending on where you're at in your comfort level, if initiating sex feels comfortable, consider, am I doing it very often? What would that be like to do? Maybe for some listeners, that's like kind of an easy thing. If they just consider and make it more at the forefront, they could just be like, oh, I could probably do that more often. And that would be awesome. For those that are a little bit more cautious or have been taught more messages over the years to kind of, again, subdue their sexuality, and it's a little more uncomfortable to put themselves out there, start with the compliments, right? I mean, if this is your partner and you think they look attractive, or you think they look cute, or you like their butt, or they look nice in an outfit, just even considering, like, am I saying those things? Like, am I making him feel wanted? Am I letting him know that I'm attracted to him, that he is desirable to me? It doesn't have to open the door into sexual activity. It's just kind of putting some things out there. Considering, am I going over and, giving a little shoulder rub, or am I the one who like gave a little kiss? Just those subtle things that just kind of show that I'm thinking about him, I'm attracted to him. Again, those examples were given across the board. So these things matter. They make men feel wanted. They make men feel special. Sometimes it turns into sexual desire and it can be kind of foreplay. Other times it's just a really nice moment. So I think it's kind of like check in with where your comfort level is right now. But most women, again, can really recognize feeling desired is so important to me. And that's a key thing. What does it feel like for me when he does it? What does it feel like for me if my partner doesn't? Maybe one day or for a week or for a longer period of time. And just consider, I wonder if he feels the same way. I wonder if me not doing it would make him kind of question my attraction to him, my desire for him. Could I lean into that just a little bit more?
Those tips definitely are for me too. Just as you were talking, I was like, yeah, I don't think that I take as much time to compliment or to notice and initiate touch, even because sometimes it's like, well, I'll wait for him, and I want to focus on that more. Because like you said, across the board, I think we all want to feel wanted and want to feel loved and noticed, especially by our person.
Yeah, exactly.
Can you talk a little bit then about how we can use this knowledge of the masculinity myth that we kind of talked a little bit about at the beginning? You said in the book to completely rewrite our understanding of men and sex and create deep sexual intimacy. How can we use what we're learning in this interview in your book to kind of rewrite those scripts?
I think the first thing is just to recognize that we have been trained to feel certain things and think certain things about our sexuality for men and women. And just to even recognize that's there, right? As soon as we say, yeah, there is a sexual script, there are expectations, then we can kind of go to that next stage and question, is it working for me? Is it working for us? Is it working in this relationship? If there's some things that are, great. If you say, you know what, like for whatever reason in our relationship, it works to have this person initiate and that person be receptive, have at her. What I find is that's very rarely the case. Usually there's room to say, what if we did it differently? What is it like for you to be the one initiating? What is it like for you if you're the one being rejected? Does it mean you're not attracted to me? Like, I think it's just getting the questions rolling and just kind of saying, you know what, there's some really, really narrow stereotypes. As a society, we're still pretty uncomfortable with sex. We don't talk about it in real, authentic ways. Whereas the way that you were raised to express your sexuality, does that feel right to you? Does that feel authentic to you? Are there ways that you maybe want to do it differently with me? And just leaving space for those conversations. I get to do that with clients all day, every day. And I see how much shifting can happen in a relationship once we kind of say, oh, well, I just thought, for women, if you said no to sex, that meant you weren't attracted to me, or that there was something wrong in our relationship. And to be able to catch that, and for men to say, no, 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 like, I'm very attracted to you. I love you. It's all good. I'm just having a really stressful time at work, and it's hard for me to shift into a sexual space. Just to give that permission to kind of challenge some of those norms. This isn't one of those nice, quick fix, just do this one like little thing and everything's going to be different. But I think recognizing these myths are ingrained, they're deep rooted. There's very good reason that we have them. Let's not judge ourselves, let's not be like blaming ourselves, but let's just recognize and then question, where do they work for us, if any place, and where do they not? And what do we want to maybe do a little bit different?
And I'm so grateful for your book, because I know for us over the years of our relationship, things have come up that have gone against the stereotypes. And then we would question, well, maybe we're just not the norm. And I love that this book is helping bring it more forward, that a lot of us may feel more comfortable now to recognize, like, no, I do feel that way. My spouse feels that way. And that's not what's considered normal, but it actually is what's normal, and shifting it to make it comfortable for us to be authentic. I think that's beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you have any other myths or things you wanted to cover before we kind of wrap up that we missed?
Well, the only thing I was just going to say at the end there was, just in terms of normality, I mean, one of the myths is not just that men's desire is high, but the men's desire is supposed to be higher than women's, right? We do this kind of compare and contrast. And just to that point of normalizing is, while we have these ideas that men's sexual desire is higher than women, when we look at almost any study that's been done that looks at couples and heterosexual couples that are in the same relationship, where women report on their level of desire and men report on their level of desire, what we see is that within any couple, it's just as likely, like a third of the time for men to have higher desire, a third of the time for women to have higher desire, and about a third of the time there to be a bit more compatibility. So in other words, like in any couple, you are just as likely to be the one as a woman with higher desire who might be interested in sex more often, who might be initiating sex, or at least wanting their partner to initiate sex and being disappointed when they don't, having a hard time when they reject, wondering what's going on. And so, just to recognize that there are a lot of couples, you're not in like the niche group. If you're a woman who's finding, hey, sometimes my male partner doesn't feel like having sex, or they don't want to have sex as often as me. And I think there's a lot more research, a lot more attention that needs to be given to these couples where women have this high sex drive. It's like, what do they do with that? Right? Because I think it can be uncomfortable to feel I'm in a different situation here, for men to be like, I've got lower desire, for women to feel like I've got higher desire, because again, that goes against the norm, and it can be just a little more complicated to navigate because we haven't seen what that looks like as often. We don't talk about what that looks like quite as often. And so just again, I just want to kind of reiterate that myth, those studies that really just show over and over again that there are many, many, many relationships, heterosexual relationships, sexual relationships that maybe aren't heterosexual, bisexual, but there's a man and a woman in a relationship where she has higher desire and he has lower desire. And, that is completely within the realm of normal human variation. So there's lots of you out there.
And we haven't had it modeled for us what that looks like because of these myths. Can you give us some tips, especially for, I'm sure there's women who are listening who are like, that's me. I'm the one who has the high desire and my spouse is saying no a lot or not interested. And I don't know how to do it. It hasn't been modeled for me. What are some tips or thoughts you would give them to help them navigate that relationship?
I mean, the first thing I would just reiterate again is it's normal, right? That doesn't mean there's anything wrong with your relationship. It doesn't mean that he's not interested in you. And there's certainly nothing wrong with you that you've got a high sexuality. That's awesome. Embrace it. Every couple is a bit different in terms of how they have to navigate that, but permission to have a conversation about, how do I express my sexuality at times where you're not interested? Is there permission that you give yourself to, masturbate or get your sexual needs met at times where there's not partnered sex? If he's not interested in having penetration, can it be receiving oral sex or helping you use a sex toy or be included in ways that he doesn't necessarily need to be interested in having like penetrative sex or something like that if he's not there? But also just normalizing having conversations, just because his desire is lower, that's normal. Okay. Like, desire discrepancies are very common in most relationships. We all have to navigate times where one person feels like sex and the other one doesn't. But him having a lower desire isn't necessarily, we have to like talk about the actual specifics of each relationship, but across the board, doesn't necessarily speak to an issue with him, doesn't necessarily speak to an issue with the relationship, doesn't necessarily speak to any issue with his attraction or feelings towards you. Chances are it's just normal human variation, and you just happen to find each other, and your desire just might be a little bit higher, his lower, and you just have to work as a couple to figure out how we're going to make this work without going to panic mode, press the red button, like this is like a bad situation. Normal human variation.
And I found that in my relationship, depending on my time of life, a lot of times we'll switch too and kind of go back and forth. And I think that goes to the basis of a lot of things we've talked about on this episode and in the podcast that it comes to communication, like figuring out what is going to work for us. How can we meet what I'm feeling like I need and want, and you need and want, and make it work for us with where we're at with our desire or our interest or our stress, and I think those are great tips. Thanks so much for bringing that up, because I think a lot of women who maybe have higher desire feel like I'm not normal, but we all are wherever we're at.
And the research is coming. More stuff is coming. More people are focusing on it. It's getting more attention. So hopefully down the road, there'll be even more conversations to be had. Just know that there's researchers whose eyes are just kind of a little bit more on that and saying, hey, just as much as we haven't been researching men with lower desire, we also haven't been giving enough space to women who have higher sex drive. So
I love that.
We're aware of it. And yeah, hopefully more is coming down the tubes.
Well, I'm excited. Let me know, and we'll get whoever it is on here, or you back on it if you're working on that. As we kind of close up, can you just share a couple actionable tips for women to start to uncover and debunk these myths? Because we've been surrounded by them for so long about what we think male sexuality is. What would be some tips that you would give to help us recognize this and see our partners as they are, instead of through the lens of the myths we've been raised with?
What I would recommend is to start by considering, what's going on in my mind when a male partner initiates. What am I assuming? Does he just want me because he's horny? Does he want me because he feels connected? Does he want me, what assumptions am I making? Just even check in with ourselves. And is that affecting how interested I am? Once we kind of know what assumptions we're making, then we can question, do I want to do it differently? Is that working? Is that fair? Should I maybe ask him how he feels about that? But again, really recognizing these stereotypes are so ingrained, they're so socially reinforced. Take a moment to consider, the myths that we've talked about today, or just consider, how is male sexuality depicted? What do I think I know about it? What do songs, what do media, what do TV shows typically show when it comes to men and sex? It usually shows them being sex crazed, hungry, looking for, lose their virginity, get laid. That's kind of the epitome. Does that fit? Does that fit for my partner? Has he said no? How do I feel when he says no? Is that fair? Maybe I should check in with him. So I think it's just, again, broad awareness of what is out there, questioning and talking, and, to your point, communicating with our partner. Does this fit for you? Does it not? Does it work for me? Does it not? There's so much more that we can do when we actually take time to question, what do I want sexuality to look like in my relationship, and not what is it, quote unquote, supposed to look like based on these really narrow stereotypes.
Thank you so much. This has been awesome to have you on today, Sarah. Where can we find you and more of your work?
Thanks again for having me. It's been so nice to talk to you. My website is www.sarahhuntermurray.com. I'm on Twitter as Sex Dr. Sarah, and I write for Psychology Today, a blog called Myths of Desire, and you can find me at any of those places.
Awesome. This has been so great. Thanks again.
Thanks for having me. It was so nice to talk to you.
I had been questioning the views around men's sexuality for a while, and I was so grateful to see Dr. Murray's book come out, and I got it and started looking through it, and I was just so grateful that she was willing to come on the show and talk to us about some of these really hurtful myths. They have been really hurtful in my life, the way that I viewed men and male sexuality, and especially then going into my relationship with my husband, to bring this baggage in of his sexuality that wasn't even necessarily true. And it's been great to open up conversations over the years, and after this book, to also realize that maybe we're not super abnormal, but that this is just misunderstood by a lot of different people and the media, and a lot of things that are portrayed in our culture portray men's sexuality in a way that isn't always accurate. So I hope this episode opens up some really good conversations with you and your partner about their sexuality, about yours, if you fall into the norms of what our culture teaches us, or if you're different, and to be able to figure it out together, what your sexuality is like and what will work in your marriage or relationship. This was such a treat to have Dr. Murray on, and I hope that if you're interested, you'll look into her book or her blog and some of her articles on Psychology Today. As always, thanks so much for joining me and talking love. Join the conversation at ladies.talkinglove on Instagram and tag your friends who would like to participate. You can also check out our website, ladiestalkinglove.com, where you can access each episode and join our exclusive newsletter. I'd love to hear your thoughts on Instagram or by email to hello@ladiestalkinglove.com as we learn together. Thanks for talking love.